Lady Oracle, in Margaret Atwood's words, is a novel about someone who lives in the real world, but lives as though this other world is the real one. If anyone watching this video is a Gothic novel fan, then this book is pitched right at you. But it also generally has a lot to say about storytelling and the narratives we create about ourselves, intentionally or unintentionally. This is Atwood's third novel. We're going through her works on this channel. My name's Eddie. Feel free to come along for the ride. Let's go. I plan my death carefully, unlike my life, which meandered from one thing to another despite my feeble attempts to control it. These lines open our story, the tale of Joan, a woman living in Taramento in Italy following her faked drowning. She talks of Arthur, a man with whom she had previously visited this place, but is now under the presumption that she is dead. We find out that she's an author of some renown, having written a book called Lady Oracle. She was also working on a manuscript at the time of her death, a Gothic novel about a woman named Charlotte, a man named Redmond, and his wife Felicia. She's quite a prolific Gothic novel writer, having written as many as 15 across her lifetime. She also, it turns out, never revealed this fact to her husband, Arthur, knowing that he wouldn't see it as a respectable profession, and that he wouldn't understand the escapism that her readers valued in her work. In flashbacks, we get taken back to the different parts of Joan's life. Firstly, her childhood under a cruel and distant mother who would constantly bemoan the fact that she didn't live up to her namesake, Joan Crawford. Joan was overweight as a child and treated horribly as a result. She tells a story of a dance recital where a mother told the dance teacher that it would be too embarrassing to let her dance a butterfly, so instead she's forced to dance a mothball. She kind of sent out to scare out the other butterflies away as kind of a comic farce. She gets laughs, but she feels horrible about it afterwards. She's also tormented by her peers. Some of her friends tie her up and leave her on a bridge over a ravine where she's previously been flashed by a man. She's rescued by a man, but is unable to tell if this guy is the same guy that had previously flashed her, and she's struck by this kind of duality. Her father, too, has a certain duality to him. He was a war doctor who took lives during the war, but is now kind of responsible for saving lives in their community and doesn't really want to talk about it either. One of the few highlights of her childhood was the time that she spent with Aunt Lou, who frequently took her to the cinemas to see films such as The Red Shoes. The two shared an affinity, with Lou taking an almost maternal role in Joan's life. One day in her high school year, she takes her to a kind of backyard chapel where she's introduced to a reverend who kind of claims that they can communicate with people from beyond the grave. They kind of say to Joan when she's in the audience that behind her there's a woman standing who is about 30 with dark hair, wearing a navy blue suit with a white collar and a pair of white gloves. Joan doesn't recognise this figure. Eventually Aunt Lou dies and leaves a rather odd request for Joan in her will. She says that she'll inherit $2,000, but only if she loses £100. She decides to diet and eventually cuts her cruel mother out of her life. After a brief interlude into her graphic novel, we kind of see what happens to Joan after she comes into her inheritance. She heads for London for no clear reason in particular, and ends up living like a Polish prince, a man who's kind of had to flee his country following communism spread, and he quickly takes her on as a mistress. To Joan's surprise, in his apartment, she finds a number of nurse-based romance novels. It's actually revealed that he wrote them as a way to kind of earn cash when he got to this country, and it sparks in Joan the idea that maybe she could actually do that herself. She not only does it, choosing to go for Gothic romances rather than the nurse romances, but is actually very good at it and quickly establishes a reputation under her pen name Louisa K. Delacour. She's able to earn a pretty good income from that. She leaves the prince after quite literally tripping onto her new boyfriend, Arthur, who has kind of been handing out leaflets in Hyde Park. Arthur was a left-wing activist with a kind of total dedication to the causes that he went in for. Despite this, Joan noticed that he always seemed to stay on the periphery of movements, never kind of heading for any position of power. They end up living together. One day when she gets a knock on the door at Arthur's flat, she finds that her mother is there and she's crying, wearing a navy blue suit with a white collar and white gloves. She just looks completely tormented, like her makeup's all smudged, and Joan closes the door on her. Soon after, she gets a telegram from her father that kind of confirms that her mother had died, and she heads back to Canada. Arthur eventually comes over to Canada, and the two get engaged when they're kind of sitting on a bench together having milkshakes and burgers. He doesn't want to get married in a church, so they end up getting married in a kind of unconventional spiritual place. It's run by the same woman that was previously the vicar in Aunt Lou's church, but she's now going under kind of an alias. The two cohabit, not entirely happy, with a mutual failure to understand each other. Joan tries doing automatic writing, a technique that had been borrowed from the spiritual church of her childhood. She kind of sits, stares at a mirror, lets like a candle flicker, and kind of lets her body do the writing for her, kind of tries to tap into something, you know? When she kind of finds that she has some writing from this, she tidies it up and eventually submits it to kind of be published. When it does in fact get published and it's hugely successful, everyone kind of assumes that it's writing a negative take on her relationship with Arthur, including Arthur himself, something that she is surprised by. Her success leads her to having an affair with a ridiculous man called the Royal Porcupine, who describes himself as a concreate poet. Listen, who among us hasn't had an affair with a monarchist-inspired, animal-based performance artist? We've all been there. This is kind of going on in the background while her husband and her friends are kind of coming together to do some revolutionary activities. Eventually, she gets pretty exasperated by their lack of action and suggests that they blow up a peace bridge. In jest. The activists, however, take her up on this idea. They have a dynamite with which to do it and kind of hide it in Joan's car. She breaks up with the porcupine, but kind of starts receiving threatening messages. Someone's phoning her number and then just kind of saying nothing, and dead animals start appearing on her front porch, including a dead porcupine. Eventually, a man breaks into her house and threatens to expose all of her different past lives to Arthur. She feels like everything is closing in around her and concocts this story to some of Arthur's activist friends about how the CIA have started tracking her and they're kind of on the case. She convinces her friends to help her carry out a fake suicide by drowning on Lake Ontario. It works, and she flees to Italy, hiding away from the world and kind of causing the consternation of the locals of her town. Increasingly convinced that she is continuously pursued, she hears a knock on the door and kind of goes to answer it, getting it confused with the Gothic novels that are going on in her mind. She kind of smashes the guy with a bottle when she opens the door, believing it's either Arthur or Redmond or a combination of the two. In fact, it turns out to be a journalist. And after helping him recover from the 7 stitches she gives him, she decides to tell him her story in full, saying she didn't tell too many lies. So in order to talk about the themes of this novel, you kind of have to talk about the literary tradition that Atwood is writing in here. Joan is the writer of Gothic costumes, Gothic romance novels, and is coming in the end of a long line that started with novels such as Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, through to Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, to the modern Gothic romance and Atwood's own satire of it. Gothic novels usually have an element of fear to them. It involves a protagonist getting taken away to some castle or manor house with kind of this mysterious, foreboding man and quite often a missing or dead wife. He usually has some kind of dark secret associated with his disappearance. When we look at the novel through this lens, we kind of see the way that this book is influenced by this literature, and the way that Joan tells the story is influenced by it. And through this, we can also see that the way that she presents the world is probably not entirely reliable. She spends most of her time writing costume Gothic, so inevitably that is going to influence her worldview. For example, she runs into the prince almost immediately after arriving in London, and she literally falls onto her future husband in Hyde Park. But it's not just these kind of rom-com romantic elements that make a Gothic novel, and indeed the terror aspect of it is something that comes through clearly in the way she tells her own life story. She becomes convinced that Arthur is the one that's leaving dead animals outside their house because he knows about the affair of the Royal Porcupine. We don't actually find out whether or not this is true. She's kind of presenting him as this malevolent and sinister presence, whereas actually it seems more likely that he is just a boring and typical example of patriarchal values in society at the time. Like, he's not a good husband, but that doesn't mean that there's hidden depths to kind of reveal about him. And like, she clearly ties in him specifically with the villain in a Gothic novel. Like, when she initially stumbles into him, she's writing the story of Samantha, who attacks her assailant with her needles and cuts a scar across his cheek. And then she finds out, when she looks at Arthur having fallen on him, that he too now has a cut on his cheek. Indeed, the words escape literature should be an escape for the writer as well as the reader, kind of provide an overarching theme of the book. Joan has been searching for escape throughout her life. In her childhood, it was films such as The Red Shoes, a film about the struggle in society for women picking between conventional gender roles and being an artist. This film also displays a way in which societally enforced dichotomies can destroy women. This escapism continues to bind her worldview as an adult. It's important to note that this escapism is not just tied to her romantic life, but also the way that she sees herself. Throughout the novel, Joan repeatedly envisioned an apparition called the Fat Lady, based on a circus exhibition she wasn't allowed to see when she was younger. The figure is clearly tied into the way that Joan reflects on her own childhood self. She's portrayed as much larger than Joan ever was, with a tutu and dancing shoes, something that clearly ties into her childhood performance of the mothball dance. But vitally, she denies that it's kind of a reductive view on how tragic it is that society made her conform to these feminine roles when she wasn't capable of doing so. It's not that. She wanted to have the shoes, to be able to dance like the other kids, and was told that she wasn't allowed to. Furthermore, she begins to associate more with the wife of her Gothic hero, Felicia. She knew as an author that her job was to kill Felicia off, but she can't bring herself to do it. And indeed, Felicia in the novel has fiery red hair, something which is kind of Joan's signature look. In the final reflective passage of the novel, she has Felicia go into the centre of a maze where she finds 4 other versions of herself, all of which calling themselves Lady Redmond. She's startled and tries to escape, but is forced to stay. 2 of them look identical to Joan as she is now and represent the 2 different people that Arthur sees Joan as. The simple-minded wife that he wants, and kind of the more sinister background figure that she thinks that he sees in her. A third is her Louisa K. Delacour personality, who kind of has borrowed the pen name of her aunt and is wearing her aunt's kind of fur collar, I guess. The 4th is, of course, the fat lady persona. This kind of passage shows a recurrent theme throughout the novel, that you can bury your past and build new identities, but they're still there in the background, and you can't quite get rid of them. Indeed, when the private investigator threatens her, it's more the threat of revealing her multitude of identities to Arthur, rather than revealing the affair that she's had, that kind of shakes her up. She's constantly afraid throughout the novel of being found out, specifically in relation to her younger self and her weight, but also in terms of her separate writer identity. She lied about her past to Arthur. At one point he sees a photo of her and Aunt Lou, and she kind of invents a 3rd aunt to kind of fill the role of the younger her, so that he doesn't know that she used to look like that. Another theme and a big part of the identity that she's trying to hide is tied into the mother-daughter relationship that she's left. She was constantly belittled in the novel, saying that she is never going to amount to any of the things that she's meant to be amounting to. Her mother is entirely unsympathetic when her friends are bullying her. She has been embittered by a disappointing marriage to a man who she's unable to kind of read fully, and a big part of why Joan is kind of pushing this Gothic persona onto Arthur is she wants to kind of spice him up so that she doesn't believe that she has been living the exact same life as her mother. Indeed, to an extent, the values that Joan kind of puts into practice with her relationship with Arthur, her pliancy, her kind of willingness to be very easy and chill with regard to him, is all stuff that she has learnt from her mother and kind of brought inside of herself. Joan's Gothic quest in this novel can be seen as her trying to come to terms with her relationship with her mother, as Szalay says. Multiple times in this novel, Mrs. Delacour is shown as this astral projection, trying to communicate with her daughter, but unable to get through. Szalay notes that it's only when she appears to her daughter on the day of her death, like a kind of Catherine Earnshaw figure, that she's finally able to get through to her as a ghost, and that Joan is finally able to admit the love that she does have for her mother. Does this novel have a happy ending? That's unclear. Atwood does not give us the easy wrap-up that costume Gothics are known for. Arguably, in nursing the journalist that she kind of bloodied with a bottle, she's actually moving into a different kind of romance novel, into kind of a nurse-based romance novel, such as the ones that the Polish Prince wrote. Atwood originally intended to start this novel with a fake suicide and end it with a real one. The fact that this is not the way she decided to end it in the end shows this ambiguity she came across when writing Joan's character. I think she would have felt hollow in kind of the wake of what society had been throwing at her, but a failure of her real death would be a disservice to the millions of women who find escape in this Gothic thinking. In the end, I enjoyed this look at escapism and the way that problems can kind of arise when you start to see fictional worlds as being useful tools to reflect on your own real experience, to the point where that becomes blurred. I would recommend anyone trying to understand this novel would go back and take a look at some of the Gothic novel predecessors. I know I will be taking another look at some of them. Feel free to hit that like button, subscribe for more thoughts on Margaret Atwood's work or just books in general. My name's Eddie. I'll catch you later.